Hi, thanks for watching episode number 76 of the Doctor Podcast Show, and I'm your host, Dr. Robert Seichert. We'd appreciate if you could subscribe and follow Doctor Podcasts so we could have great guests like we're going to have today. And if you like this episode, and I'm sure you'll love it because it's very educational and informative, please also like and repost this episode. Today, we're going to discuss a very important topic, and that topic is lung cancer. November is actually Lung Cancer Awareness Month, and lung cancer unfortunately affects hundreds of thousands of people in the USA and around the world. So it's important to find out about it and how can we prevent it and treat it better. But prevention is key. Our guest today is one of the top experts in the world on lung cancer and cancer in general. It's Dr. Peter Bach. Dr. Bach is a physician. He's the chief medical officer of a company called Delphi Diagnostics, which has a liquid biopsy cancer screening device, which we'll talk about today and discuss some more. Previously, Dr. Bach was a director of the Center for Health Policy and Outcomes at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Medical Center in New York City, which is one of the two top cancer centers in the USA, if not the world. He's board certified in both internal medicine as well as pulmonary and critical care medicine, and also a lung specialist. He's also been a writer for the New York Times, New York Magazine. He's published many articles on this subject in various peer-reviewed medical journals. He's also been a consultant for the government and Medicare on cancer and lung-related issues. So, Peter, thanks very much for taking the time from your busy schedule to join us today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
All right. So I want to discuss the fact I mentioned November is Lung Cancer Awareness Month, which is very important. How significant a problem is lung cancer? Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. The good news, I'll start with the good news, which is we're making continued progress in lung cancer, and we're also seeing a slow decline in the incidence rates. But it is still the case that lung cancer is the number one cancer killer of both men and women in the United States. It's underappreciated, but the number of deaths among women basically equals the number of deaths among men at this point because of smoking patterns from several decades ago. It's also the number one cancer killer globally. And that is because of a high degree of tobacco use and other sorts of carcinogen exposures, throughout the globe. And so lots of progress has been made, as I mentioned, but still a very big problem and a major contributor to both death and disability.
Right. Now, I looked at the CDC website. The latest data they had was about 210,000 people a year just in the USA get lung cancer, which is a huge number. Approximately what percentage of those unfortunately die from the disease?
Yeah, it's a very aggressive disease, particularly today, because mostly it's found where it's more advanced. It's spread either throughout the lung to another part of the lung or outside of the lung. And when it's advanced like that, we use the staging system, of course. So stages of 3 and 4, which are more advanced, the disease is difficult to treat. Again, we're making progress. There's new drugs, which is
Right.
wonderful news. We've seen a real revolution in targeted therapy and immune therapies, but still, the simple fact is there's slightly over 200,000 people diagnosed each year, and there's close to 140 to 150,000 who die of it each year. So that gives you a sense of just how deadly it is.
Wow, so that's about a 75% mortality rate. That's extremely high and much higher than for other cancers, you're saying.
No, that's right. Some of the other common cancers, obviously very big problems themselves, breast cancer, prostate cancer, they do have better survival. Part of the reason for that is that we have early detection, for example, for breast cancer. We have early detection for colorectal cancer, which claims many lives as well. but far fewer today because we have early detection and we're capturing those cancers earlier in their disease course.
Right. So, what causes lung cancer and who's at risk for getting lung cancer?
Yeah, so the dominant cause of lung cancer is exposure to tobacco, particularly cigarettes. We've gone through several generations of heavy use of tobacco. It's, of course, now declining, which is terrific news. There's fewer kids picking up cigarettes and starting to smoke, which I think bodes well for our future. But you could probably attribute about 4 out of 5 lung cancer cases to exposure to cigarettes or other tobacco products. The lungs are, of course, a filter. They're exposed to everything in the environment as air moves in and out of them. And so other kinds of carcinogens, some workplace exposures, certain kinds of dusts, exposure to other environmental pollutants, diesel fumes and things like that. Some particular types of employment put you at risk, such as being a firefighter, both because of chemical and smoke exposure. And then even some, believe it or not, some basements in homes have radon in them, which puts you at risk for lung cancer. So there's many causes. And all put together, that doesn't explain the disease entirely. There's some elements of, if you will, bad luck or things we have yet to define. But
Right.
there's no question that the number one cause is smoking. And so the number one hope long term is to get fewer people to smoke and particularly fewer people to start smoking.
Right. What about vaping? I'm here in New York City, and I see people on the street all the time vaping. Is that a cause of lung cancer as well? Do we know for sure?
We don't know for sure. The data would take, hopefully, we'll never get to levels of vaping where we'll know definitively it is causing it.
Right.
It's always a question of, is it vaping instead of cigarette smoking, in which case we should heavily prefer it. If it's vaping instead of not inhaling any burning substance, we'd heavily prefer if nobody breathes in anything that's been ignited and is emitting vapors, because it isn't good for you.
Right. What about pipes or cigars? Some people inhale that as well. Is that also a risk factor?
It is. So pipe smoking, I'm not an expert on, but that's mostly causes, I mean, it has many carcinogens. It mostly causes upper airway and oral cancers, tongue cancers, and things like that.
Right.
Cigar smoking, it's true, the behavior is, the way it's used is varied. But just as a number, if you want to impress your friends about how scary cigars are, the typical cigar, if you smoke it, it's like smoking 70 cigarettes. So three
Really?
and a half packs of cigarettes in a sitting. So as you point out, a lot of people don't inhale it, but you're still like filling your upper airway with carcinogens. It's not a good thing.
So the lesson is don't smoke anything. Just stay away from any tobacco product is your best bet.
Of course, all health advice has to be balanced with, reasonableness of what people do. So I always, I really prefer that people try and, let's avoid people starting smoking because it becomes a lifelong habit. And if
Right.
people choose to have a pipe or a cigar, just like try and reserve it for special occasions as opposed to it becoming habitual.
Right. What about age groups? Are certain age groups at higher risk, or does it depend on how many years of smoking you've done?
Yeah, they're both independent risk factors, but as you age is a risk factor for almost all cancers. There's a few cancers that are particularly occurring amongst young people, but they're unusual. Uh, so yeah, age is an independent risk factor for lung cancer, but smoking is the most powerful one, and it easily swamps the age effect.
So the more years you've smoked, the higher your risk, basically.
The more years you smoked, and just the older you are, both of those things. And in fact, the amount you smoke as well. So if you smoke half a pack a day or you smoke a pack over a week on average, your risk is lower than if you smoke a pack a day or even 2 packs a day. But again, all of these things confer excess risk. Stopping smoking is extremely effective at lowering your risk, and mostly because it stops the rapid rise in risk. So you continue to age, your risk never goes away, but in terms of compounding the risk, you stop that from happening.
Right. Is there a increased risk with certain racial groups, or is there genetic or familial tendency to get lung cancer?
I mean, there are rare genetic diseases that have repair defects that put people at risk for multiple cancers. But from a population standpoint, there's no question that being poor, living in environments with a great amount of carcinogens, and other sorts of exposures are associated with being in lower socioeconomic class, and obesity as well, are all associated with higher cancer risks, including lung cancer. The genetic basis is much less clear. There are certain groups, for example, women who either in several Asian countries or actually immigrated to the West but derive from those places. They have a much higher risk of cancer
Hmm.
of the lung, even if they've never smoked. It's a different kind of cancer, typically driven by a particular mutation, but that's one group that stands out as having very high rates of lung cancer.
That's interesting. Obesity is a risk factor, seems for every cancer and lots of other diseases. Well,
That's true.
what about the asbestos issue? I see still ads on TV all the time, law firms that are suing various companies because people got lung cancer from asbestos. I thought asbestos was basically eliminated from buildings and construction, but apparently it's still around. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right, Robert. But there's definitely there's residual effects. There is asbestos in buildings that still around. I think probably in New York City. The best thing with that asbestos is to leave it alone. The risk is during the work done with it, not once it's in place. That said, asbestos abatement happens because people start doing renovations or things have to be built underneath them. So it for a long period of time, it was a major cause not only of lung cancer, but also of cancers of certain types of lining, like the lining of the lung, the lining of the peritoneum. But I trained in Baltimore, and so I'm very familiar with the asbestos ads on television because the person who purchased the Baltimore Orioles made all of his money suing asbestos, suing on behalf of asbestos plaintiffs.
Really?
So a major, uh, you know, say what you want about lawyers who are posting those ads, but they are the reason we no longer have workers exposed to that kind of workplace toxin. So, and we have a pretty good baseball team too. So it's a not a win-win at all, not something to take lightly, but a really important public health step forward that we don't expose people to asbestos, which is a very convenient material, just very deadly.
Right. So that's good that they brought that to the attention of the public and it helps us long term. What about the symptoms of lung cancer? What symptoms would someone have if they're developing lung cancer?
Yeah, so there's a standard list of symptoms, but just as a clinician, the challenge is there's symptoms that can be present from many other things as well. And particularly because we've talked about the relationship of smoking to lung cancer, they can be more common, these symptoms, in people just due to the smoking exposure and other diseases or disorders that can develop. So things like cough, shortness of breath, unexplained weight loss. Those are kind of cardinal features of lung cancer, but those are also cardinal features of advancing emphysema or COPD. People who smoke have a higher risk of getting pneumonias that can cause these things. During the first few waves of COVID, it was clear that, some of the overlapping symptoms as well. So the most important thing is symptoms that arise like that that persist in anybody, even somebody who has not smoked, should be evaluated for it's the causes there. And if they're not self-limited, if they're not easily managed or treated, that would be a reason to look further.
So these symptoms aren't that specific, so that's not helpful. But any symptom that just persists and doesn't go away should be checked out as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that's always good advice, and
Right.
particularly if they're pulmonary or cardiac symptoms, because some of these things can also be caused. Those symptoms can be caused by cardiac disease, which isn't intuitive to a lot of people.
Right. So who should be screened for lung cancer and why is screening and catching this early so important?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking me that. The idea of cancer screening is that cancer at first is just localized. It starts as a small collection of cells in one place in the lung. If we can catch it then, we can typically fully treat it, either by removing it surgically, which can be done with only minimally invasive techniques now, robots and other sorts of things where you don't have to go through some big surgery, or even if it's localized in certain parts of the lung, it can be treated with radiotherapy or radiation with a very targeted gun beam of radiation that kills those cells. That's terrific, and outcomes are quite good if you treat it early like that. If the disease advances, it grows, it starts to spread, the treatment options become more limited, the ability to completely remove it with surgery declines, and then you can be in a situation where you need systemic treatments such as chemotherapy or immune therapies. And those have gotten better and better every year, but still are not effective at the level that early stage treatment is. So about 15 years ago, actually going back as far as 20, uh, became an interest in starting to look for small lesions in the lung, small lung cancers with imaging, specifically a CAT scan, which is a fancy X-ray machine that takes multiple very rapid pictures of your lung. And a big study run by the National Cancer Institute, where half of the people randomly were screened for lung cancer with CT and the others were not screened with CT, showed that 20% of lung cancer deaths in that group would be prevented just by annual screening and then the treatment of early stage cancers. A few years later, a very similar study in Europe demonstrated the same thing. In fact, a slightly larger benefit of 24%. And in fact, the US study showed that overall death rates were reduced by CT screening. So if we back up to where this conversation started, this is the number one cancer killer of men and women. We have a proven technology and a proven approach to preventing deaths in that group. And it's recommended in people who are at high enough risk that being screened makes sense. And that is people ages 50 to 80 who've smoked for 20 pack years or more. A pack year is, I smoked for a year, 1 pack a day, that's a pack year. You can also get a pack year. I smoked a half a pack a day for 2 years, so a half times two is also a pack year. But 20 pack years, and it's for people who either are currently smoking or they have quit within the last 15 years. They've quit many years, for a much longer period, 20 or 30 years. It's not recommended by the United States Preventive Services Task Force, a major guideline organization. But in fact, the American Cancer Society still says, be screened. If you've had 20 pack years of smoking, even if you quit a while ago, you should still be screened.
Right. Now, some of my patients, and I'm an ophthalmologist, so we don't talk that much about lungs, but some of them mentioned to me that they're worried about getting screened because even though they're smokers, they feel there's radiation from the CAT scan. But my understanding is that it's very low dose radiation. Is that correct?
It is the technology. It is a low dose scan. The technology has improved very quickly, and so if I think back to my training, there was quite a bit of which is a long time ago. There was a lot of radiation and also a lot of time to take a CAT scan. Um, the technologies, the detectors, and even the way it's acquired has improved. And now a scan takes 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and is very low
Wow.
dose. And there's no IV. You don't have to give anyone anything in their blood vessels, contrast or anything, because you don't need to see anything but the lung parenchyma, the body of the lung itself. And we can use a very simple snapshot on a CAT scan to see that quite effectively. And a number of studies have shown that that is just as good at lung cancer detection as a more detailed scan. Some general, the amount of radiation is real. If you start to think about scanning millions of people over time, you may cause a cancer or two. So I don't want to pretend it's nothing.
Mm.
But in relative terms, the potential benefit of finding a lung cancer is thousands of times more beneficial than the small amount of radiation it would take to find it.
Right, especially if you've been a smoker for a long time.
Well,
And
that's why we focus on people who have been smoking, so that the chance of their having lung cancer, we never want somebody to have lung cancer, but so that we're only screening the people who have a better than average chance of having the disease. Because those are
right,
the only ones we can help with screening, is the ones that we find they have the disease and we find it early.
what about MRI scans? Those don't have radiation at all. Do they pick up the early lung cancers or not as well as the low dose CT scans?
Not as well. There's never been a study with MRI. It's not particularly good at looking at the lung. It's much better at separating out soft tissues and differences in densities. That's why, it's used for the interior of joints and the brain and things like that.
Right.
And remember, the
So,
lung is really just an airbag, right? So we're just trying to see small amounts of tissue in a field of air.
right. So, since we know that this is a very effective screening tool and very safe, why is it that the people are not getting screened? Apparently, the percentage of people who should be screened is very low.
Yeah, it's frustrating, to be honest. The percentage, according to the American Lung Association, of the 15 million people in this country, in the US, who should be screened each year, it's only about 4% who are. A recent survey came out and put it more like 15 to 18%. Either way, those numbers are too low. In the Veterans Administration, a study came out a few years ago, put the number was about 2%. So we're not doing it. And the reason isn't because the data don't support it. The data supporting lung cancer early detection in this group is some of the strongest we have in cancer screening. And I think the reality is doctors who need to order it, particularly primary care doctors, are very busy. Um, Often patients who have a smoking history have more acute or pressing problems that need to be managed. And screening and the discussion about screening is a can that keeps getting kicked down the road.
Hmm.
That is not a criticism of my colleagues. I'm a physician who focuses on acute illness. I certainly understand the importance to prioritizing that, what's in front of you and what's causing the patient discomfort or harm in the moment. The other thing is we don't have an organized system like we have for mammography, where you refer the patient, but then everything that happens after that is managed through a centralized facility with expertise. When somebody goes for a mammogram, any abnormality is then followed up. If a biopsy is needed, it is referred to and performed. When we send people for a CT scan for their lung, the result goes right back to the primary care doctor in most cases. There are some centralized places, and they have excellent outcomes. But the reality is, in most of the United States, still, you refer that and then you get these abnormalities. And even though lung cancer screening is recommended, it's only a subset of your patients. And now you have to figure out what to do with those abnormalities. And you want to be able to reassure the patient, which means you need a great deal of confidence and experience in it. Or you have to refer the patient to somebody like me, a pulmonologist. And there aren't that many pulmonologists out there available for follow-up of nodules and things like that.
Hmm. Seems like if screening was done more efficiently and on more people, we could dramatically reduce the incidence of the severe lung cancers and the mortality rate would be reduced tremendously.
Any way you do the math, you would be saving 10,000 to 20,000 lives per year.
Wow, that's
If
huge.
we did it. It's huge. It's driven by two things. It's the number one cancer killer, and the benefit of screening is large. And so it's why we pursued lung cancer at Delphi Diagnostics because of the public health opportunity.
Right. So tell us about Delphi Diagnostic and tell us what a liquid biopsy is and what that means and how it's different than the traditional surgical type of biopsy.
Yeah, so liquid biopsy is just a term that's started to be applied to drawing blood typically and using it to observe or infer the presence of cancer somewhere else in the body, not directly where you've drawn the blood. And it's a useful term, and because as you just mentioned, Robert, when you say the word biopsy, I mean, we generally think, okay, that's a needle or an aspirate or whatever into the tissue of tissue of interest, right, or organ of interest. So a kidney biopsy is a needle you stick in the kidney, and then you see, do they have nephritis or something like that. So liquid biopsy takes advantage of the fact that in the setting of cancer, DNA and other elements of that we can grab from the blood either can come from a cancer site. For example, our blood test relies on the fact that DNA from the lung cancer is getting into circulation and we can find it, or things that go into the bloodstream that are secondarily derived from the cancer. So people are interested in looking at protein levels in the blood. It's not that the protein is made by the cancer, it's made in response to it. So either way, you're grabbing something from the circulation that's telling you about something happening somewhere else in the body. And hence the term liquid biopsy. And it's a convenient term for that because it conveys the clinical implication of biopsy and the mechanical reality that we're just using venous blood.
But in essence, you're just doing a blood test, just like a patient would have any other blood test to check their cholesterol or kidney function or blood sugar, right?
That's right. Yeah. If I showed you our tube, you would say that looks like a phlebotomy tube. It's a 10 ml tube, and for us, it comes in a kit. So it's in a cardboard box with a mailer in it. And you draw the patient's LDL or whatever, their CBC, and you draw a first look lung test and send it off to our lab in Palo Alto.
Hmm. So that's the name of your product. It's called First Look.
Yes, First Look Lung. It's the only commercially available lung cancer screening test on the market. And it is being used by health systems now that recognize that lung cancer screening is important to do and can benefit their population, and recognize the challenge of doing it at scale. They've been trying for years and years without something simple that can go to the point of care like a blood test.
Hmm. So does Delphi's First Look for DNA or the secondary proteins or both? What is it that you're finding in the blood that tips you off that the patient may have lung cancer?
Yeah, and we're looking at DNA in the blood, and the technology we have came out of researchers at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and they realized that we can look at the DNA and it's whether or not it is circulating in normal length fragments or shorter fragments, essentially. And if shorter, which parts of the DNA are shorter in order to tell if somebody has lung cancer. And this is a very interesting and important and counterintuitive insight. When I say shorter fragments and longer fragments, it should sound pretty unsophisticated. It's not some deep sequencing and lots of things about, is there a mutation here, mutation there? And it's true. It's a very simple idea. DNA in a cancer cell has a different architecture than DNA in a normal cell. That is, the genetic replication abnormalities of cancer are its cornerstone feature. What the researchers at Hopkins realized was when that DNA gets released into circulation, its abnormal architecture is preserved, which means when the body starts digesting it, it digests it, leaving essentially an edifice of that abnormal architecture that we can recognize by measuring the lengths of the DNA fragments. So, as I said, it's not intuitive, But what we've been able to show is that we can run a very inexpensive test doing just sequencing the entire genome and then essentially reconstructing the architecture and figure out if there's the residua of lung cancer cells in circulation from it. And
Wow.
so, yeah, it's terrific. And one of
Yeah.
the keys with screening is to do something at scale. It has to be inexpensive. You can't have a test that's thousands of dollars for each person if you need to screen 10 million, 15, 20 million people, which is what we're talking about every single year. So the test is built on a platform that's low cost, uses very little blood. As I mentioned, it's only a single tube, and we don't use even all of that. It gives us enough in case we have a specimen which we need to rerun. And it allows us to market it for a cost where we could screen at scale.
Right. Now, I was looking at the website for the first look test, and it mentioned about machine learning, which is a type of AI. How is machine learning or AI involved in testing for this abnormal varying DNA from the lung cancer cells?
Yeah, no, Robert, thanks for asking. The explanation I try to give about the fragments and their lengths is I hope intuitive enough, but in reality, we have millions of data points about the DNA from each subject, and we need to be able to sort through the subjects that have lung cancer from the ones who don't. Human beings can't process that much multidimensional data, but computers can. And so we use machine learning methods that are pretty well advanced at this point in the field, and we have cutting edge approaches with AI as well, so that we let the computer figure out what looks like somebody with lung cancer, what looks like somebody who doesn't have lung cancer. We've trained them with thousands and thousands of samples and now have published in Cancer Discovery, a very good basic science journal, that with an independent test set with our test, we can separate out people with lung cancer and identify 80% of them while leaving apart the other group that doesn't have lung cancer.
Right. So if this is just kind of a routine blood test, can a patient go to their primary care doctor or other doctor and say, hey, I'd like a first look blood test because I smoked cigarettes for 20 years? And is it available at LabCorp or Quest if the doctor doesn't do blood tests in the office? Can the doctor just write a prescription for it? Patient goes to a lab, gets it done, and then it's sent to Delphi to analyze?
Yeah, that's the direction we're going. We're being, I think, judicious in how we're starting. So some patients, certainly at the major systems that we have partnerships with, like Allegheny Health Network, Order St. Francis in Illinois, as well as patients in some hard to reach areas, like we have a partnership with Indigenous PAC on tribal lands. We're working in East LA with the City of Hope Cancer Center as well. So those patients are being tested and their doctors are ordering our test. And we don't want to make the mistake that happened when we launched CT screening. We want this to work. And so we are launching at a pace with partners who are committed to figuring out how to go from a technology that clearly works, our blood test, to making sure patients get screened for lung cancer and they do so at a reliable rate. They come back the next year and things like that. So stay tuned on the various other partnerships, LabCorp, Quest, things like that. But the plan is, as we roll out these systems, we're going to make sure they are ready, make sure we've tuned it to their population, we have the right materials for their population, so that we can have success in what we're really trying to achieve here, which is reducing the burden of lung cancer.
Right. So let's say somebody gets the test, the first look test, and it's positive, meaning the test found evidence of cancer related DNA. What's the next step that the patient does as a result of that positive blood test?
Yeah, so the test returns the positive result on the test is referred to as elevated, which means we've seen an elevated signal. Their patterns of fragmentation of DNA are abnormal, which could be a sign of lung cancer. On our test report, it says in that case, they should go and get a low-dose CAT scan, the CAT scan that is used for screening. That is covered by
Right.
insurance. There's no out-of-pocket cost for it. It's recommended by guidelines, and that's the group that should go. Our test is not a diagnostic test for lung cancer. It's a risk determining test so that it can be used and say, okay, of all the people who are eligible, the people with the elevated result are the ones most likely to have lung cancer. And so they should go on for a CT scan.
What's the false positive and false negative rate? False positive meaning the blood test, the first look blood test comes out abnormal, but
Right.
then if you do the follow-up low dose CT scan, that comes out normal. What's the incidence of that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I hate to repeat myself, but it's not a diagnostic test. The
Right.
expectation is, let me frame it this way, and I'll answer both questions. Screening is always about examining a whole bunch of people to find a few cancers. The math there is always hundreds, sometimes thousands of people need to be screened to find a cancer. What we've done in lung cancer is we've focused on this group 50 to 80 with 20 pack years or more. If you look at that group as a whole, you need on average to send 140 some odd people to get a CT to find a lung cancer. If you take that group now and run first look on them, and you send only those with an elevated result, you need to send about 75, 76 people to find a lung cancer. In other words, you've doubled the likelihood there's lung cancer. It's still true that most of them won't have lung cancer, right? You have to send 76 to find a lung cancer. That means 75 didn't have it. But that's not how, screening isn't about making sure when you send somebody they have the disease. It's making sure that if they have the disease, you send them for screening. Those are very different concepts. And so what we are trying to do is take that large population that's eligible, use the blood test to figure out what subset really needs to get a CAT scan because that in that population is where the lung cancers are.
Right.
Our sensitivity is 80%, which means that we will find 4 out of 5 lung cancers by doing that, while reducing by 50% the number of CAT scans that need to be done.
Sounds great, especially because it's a zero risk, essentially, blood test.
It's a normal venipuncture, it's
Right.
mildly unpleasant unless people don't like needles, but usually patients like this are getting blood tests anyway. And so we think it
Right.
works in the flow, and more importantly, or equally important, we have a very large opportunity or unrealized opportunity to reduce the burden of this disease through early detection, and we have not been able to do it by doing primary CT. And so we're hoping this will help be a good first test for the 96% of people who aren't being screened. And then when they have an elevated result, that will give another reason both for the patient and the doctor to let's get this CT scan and see. Hopefully they still won't have lung cancer, but we
Right.
want to find it if they do.
So you're basically finding the people at high risk, and as a result, you're catching the disease earlier, and the treatment is easier, the results are better, less mortality.
That's exactly right. And that's how screening is supposed to work. And we just this is, I think, a way to get adoption.
Right. I don't see any downside. Now, is this test currently covered by Medicare or insurance or Medicaid?
We do have an insurance partner, but it's not covered by Medicare or Medicaid yet. Everything is uh, appropriate steps of development. So we have breakthrough designation with the Food and Drug Administration for our test because of its potential public health benefit and innovative science. It's currently a laboratory developed test, so it's run out of Palo Alto. It's a CLIA CAP lab, and that's actually how most diagnostic and screening tests are on the market, or at least start on the market. But we are pursuing FDA approval, have had positive interactions, and have completed our pivotal study and are in follow-up for FDA approval.
Yeah, once that occurs, seems like Medicare should basically pay for it because it'll save them hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in treating patients for advanced lung cancer. So it'll be actually a huge savings, especially since you mentioned the incidence of lung cancer goes up with age, even if you're not a smoker. So it seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's an important problem for Medicare, and we hope to be able to improve screening rates. They already pay for low-dose CT screening. They, of course, have their own process and will evaluate the test and our data. We are working hard to have the highest quality data to meet that kind of scrutiny, as well as the FDA's scrutiny, all which we think is really important. If you want to market a screening test particularly, you're going to people who are otherwise healthy and saying, I want to run this test on you and see if you have a disease, you should have the highest quality data supporting your claim that your test actually works. And we've already published some really good data, and we have more coming.
That's great. Is Delphi Diagnostics also working on other liquid biopsies for other cancers, like the most common ones, which are breast and prostate and colon cancer, because those kill several million people annually?
Yeah, those are all, you're absolutely right. The platform I described, which uses this DNA fragment approach, has potential for many other cancers. Our first paper that started the company essentially in 2019 showed detection and discrimination for 7 different cancers. We could not only find them, but tell them apart. We've recently published data in liver cancer detection as well. Liver cancer is a meaningful problem in the US. It's a massive problem globally. And one of the nice things, and we think important elements of our platform, is because it's low cost and the laboratory processes are relatively straightforward, we can democratize access to this throughout the world, which we think is important to tackling this problem. But we do actually, because we have a way of looking at the DNA and detecting cancer that is highly sensitive and low cost, we do have a research use only product, and we just had a big paper talking about prospective validation of this, and it's a monitoring test. So rather than trying to detect cancer, this test looks at the amount of tumor DNA in the blood, and we've been able to show that for a patient who's getting treatment, we can see if the amount of tumor DNA goes up or down or stays the same after treatment. This approach, called treatment monitoring, is very important in advanced cancer, and we have data in a bunch of different therapies. And the reason is oncology is precise in many ways, but it's empiric also in others. And so much of what oncologists do, and I was at Sloan Kettering for more than 20 years, is you give treatments, you of course hope they work, but you also want to know if they're not working anymore. And so this test, this monitoring assay, which we're only using for research right now with pharmaceutical company partners, would allow doctors to both know good news, the treatment is working, but also when the news is less good, that it's stopped working, to change therapies, to look for clinical trials, to take other steps sooner while the patient, is ready and healthy enough for it, and not waste either time or money or accrue toxicity when a treatment isn't working.
Right. It would seem that each cancer has its own DNA biomarker, so to speak, and with machine learning and AI, we'll eventually learn what all those biomarkers are and be able to not only detect early cancer, but like you said, monitoring it would be incredible because if you treat somebody and you see the blood levels going down of certain biomarker, you know that that treatment is working, or if it's not working, switch to something else.
Exactly right. And so the pace of learning has been truly remarkable. I feel very lucky that my career started in focusing on oncology at Sloan Kettering as a pulmonologist in the late 90s before the human genome was sequenced. And so I've gotten to witness this entire thing from those days. And of course, that was extremely expensive and took years to, desktop sequencing and more therapies and tests that based on it than any of us could count. It's been amazing.
Yeah, it's been incredible, the movements that I've seen over the decades. Well, this has been very informative and educational. It's especially appropriate because, as I mentioned, November is Lung Cancer Awareness Month. And I really want to thank you for your time that you've taken to explain this all to us. And I'm sure the audience will appreciate it as well.
Robert, thank you so much for your time and your interest in this topic. And you're absolutely right. November is Lung Cancer Awareness Month, and we have real opportunities to help people with the disease. And so very much appreciate your questions.
Thank you.